you take this drug, you perturb the brain with this molecule, and it suddenly starts speaking a language it never learned to speak. It starts constructing worlds that don't bear any relationship to the world that the brain evolved and learned to construct.
Dr. Andrew Gallimore, what is the building alien worlds thesis?
What is the building alien worlds thesis? Well, you've really gone straight to it there. Building alien worlds, actually, the building alien world is a title of a paper I wrote in 2012, which derived from the idea that, so it's connected to DMT, basically the idea that in normal waking consciousness, we inhabit a world, and this is a world that is, when I say a world, I mean the subjective world, the experience of a world, and this world is constructed by the brain. It's built by the brain. So all the time your brain is kind of building the normal world, if you like, which functions as a kind of a model of the environment, an adaptive but not necessarily truthful model of the environment. When you take DMT, where the alien comes in, you enter an entirely different world that has no relationship really to the normal waking world. It's an entirely alien world, but in the same way, it must in some way be instantiated within your neural machinery. Whatever you say about the ontology of the DMT world and the entities that inhabit it, the world must have a representation in the brain. At least that's my fundamental and I think sort of axiomatic assumption, which I think is well supported. And so that's why that paper was called Building Alien Worlds. When you take DMT, your brain begins building alien worlds.
Yes, it's super cool. It's such a fascinating thread that the podcast has been going on in this predictive brain, psychedelics, morphing consciousness, shifting consciousness. All of these topics are super interesting to me at the moment. Is there something specific about DMT? Is there an LSD alien world and a psilocybin alien world that are sort of similar but different and share characteristics? Or is there something unique about DMT in your view?
Well, I think a number of ways we can approach this, but I mean, all psychedelics are different in their own way, right? All psychedelics, the classic psychedelics, they all share certain pharmacological commonalities in their mechanism of action. But DMT it's unique in a number of ways in kind of how far it gets you and how efficiently. I very often use the metaphor of of those old radio sets with the dialing, the kind of the dial. You won't remember those, you're too young, but back in the day, you used to have these radio sets and you'd have to tune to the frequency. And when you were in one frequency, you were hearing the radio, and then you had to kind of get to the next frequency. And in between, you had a lot of noise and kind of static and interference and all that stuff. The classic psychedelics, they kind of nudge the dial, if you like, away from the normal waking world, but they don't reliably kind of get you all the way to the new channel, whereas DMT does. It's very, very cleanly and efficiently kind of dismantles or obliterates the normal waking world and kind of replaces it with one that is altogether different, far more complex, far more interesting in many ways, bewildering, astonishing, mind-blowing, awesome, choose your word, I think. So that's what I think is unique about, that's, in terms of its effects, I think that's what makes DMT particularly unique. But to get to your question, yes, other psychedelics, and not just psychedelics either. I mean, high doses of ketamine will take you to another world. There seems to be, in my second book, Reality Switch Technologies, I describe what I call the world space, which is kind of if you imagine all possible worlds that your brain can construct, basically the state space of the human cortex. If you plot it on a plane, you get this kind of world space landscape, and we sit, the consensus reality space, as I call it, kind of sits within this well, this low energy well within the world space landscape. And that's where most people spend the vast majority, if not the entirety of their lives, within this very limited region of the world space. And DMT seems to kind of catapult you into an entirely different region of the world space, but different drugs will take you to different areas as well. I think there's a lot to explore.
Very cool. Very well explained. I love it. Do we know, or has there been analysis done comparing the similarity in the trip reports with DMT compared with other psychedelics? A point that you've mentioned a couple of times now already is that DMT is somewhat consistent in the types of reality warping effects that it has. We're going to talk a lot about DMT entities, and I want to get really into that. But has there been a really good analysis showing that, a certain percentage of people see this on DMT and then it's this amount on psilocybin and this amount on LSD, and really characterizing the sort of consistency and similarities of these different trips?
Well, I mean, you mentioned the word entities there, and I think that's, for most people, that's the most interesting feature of the DMT state, is that it's not just another world, but it's a world that is abundantly populated. And there have been a number of studies. I think comparing DMT to a standard dose of psilocybin, for example, with very high doses, it's a different matter entirely, but they're quite unusual. Most people don't take very, very high doses of psilocybin, sort of heroic doses in kind of McKenna terminology. So it's kind of almost like comparing apples to oranges. In that, psilocybin and LSD in usual dose ranges don't kind of transport you to other worlds where you're meeting entities. So in that sense, there've been none of those kind of comparisons. There have been, of course, comparisons, in terms of neuroimaging data and that kind of thing, and there are many commonalities there. But in terms of the phenomenology, DMT is unique in that it will take you to a world that seems to be populated by entities that are non-human, non-animal, often seem to be far more complex, far more intelligent, far more cognitively sophisticated than humans, far, far, far stranger than any being that you're likely, any earthly creature that you're ever going to encounter. And there've been, quite a few really good studies looking at, the prevalence of entities and indeed the prevalence of particular types of entities within the DMT space. So overall, around 50% of people, with any one individual experience of DMT, 50% of the time people will experience entities. In one study, it was actually much higher, with kind of seasoned DMT users. I think it was as high as like 90% in a naturalistic setting study carried out by David Luke at the University of Greenwich with his PhD student Pascal Michael. But generally, yes. People see entities, and there are a number of types that come up again and again, ranging from kind of amorphous beings of light, all the way through to small, giggling, jovial beings like machine elves, as they're, as McKenna used to call them, through to insectoid beings, reptilians, and godlike beings, and giant cats made of liquid crystal gels, and just weird, outrageous beings that kind of defy description, I think. So trying to put a label on them sometimes and categorize them is actually quite challenging.
Yeah. And is there any consistency in the people that are tripping and their interactions with these entities? Are the entities, do they always have the same motivations or goals? Is there any overlap in those reports?
Not always, but there are, again, common themes. So what are often described as pedagogical experiences, so teaching experiences, where the entity kind of will guide the tripper, so a guiding presence that's kind of takes your hand, if you like, and pulls you through, carries you through the experience. That's very common. And some kind of teaching, some kind of it often takes the form of some kind of download of highly complex information that is bewildering. It's like it's almost like they don't really want you to understand it, but they're just trying to kind of impress upon you that they know far more about everything than you ever could, that any human ever could. Just vast amounts of highly complex, clearly non-human derived information. Complex geometric and symbolic imagery that kind of floods into the user. This is very common as well. I would say they're the most common types of experiences, kind of guiding and teaching. But then there are um, you know interactions that range from completely ignoring you all the way through to fortunately quite rare experience where there actually can be quite confrontational, shall we say, or mocking experiences. Some people have very unpleasant experiences where they're being mocked by these, jester-like beings, mocked for their stupidity, or outright anger, like, "What are you doing here? You shouldn't be here. How did you get here?" That kind of experience, but they're relatively rare. Most interactions are, on the whole, quite positive.
Super interesting. Is it that reliability of reports? Would you say that's the strongest piece of evidence that you have for why you think that this DMT world is maybe as real as the world we are inhabiting now, or that it's not simply a hallucination? That world is a deeply ingrained structure in our brains in some sort of way that we don't fully understand.
Yes, I mean, I think it's very difficult to explain. I mean, that paper that I wrote, that I mentioned before, Building Alien World, back in 2012, that was the first time I made the argument that the DMT experience is, if we assume that the human brain is a product of evolution, which most reasonable scientists will do, um, the world that your brain constructs is also a product of evolution. Your brain evolved to construct this world model. It's a learning process. It takes place over evolutionary epochs, but also, from the moment you're born, your brain is sampling sensory information from the environment and using it to construct a world model. And it's always doing that and always testing its model and refining its model. It's like learning a language in a way. You aren't born with the ability to speak English. When I first arrived in Japan over a decade ago, I certainly wasn't immediately speaking Japanese. And when I was dreaming as well, people in my dreams didn't speak Japanese. And there's a very good reason for that. If they were speaking Japanese, like correctly, fluently, that would be completely confounding because my brain didn't know at the time how to construct that language. And in a way, the DMT experience is kind of like that. It's like you take this drug, you perturb the brain with this molecule, and it suddenly starts speaking a language it never learned to speak. It starts constructing worlds that don't bear any relationship to the world that the brain evolved and learned to construct. That is not just entirely different to the normal waking world, but is far more complex, staggeringly complex, but perfectly finessed, engineered to utter precision with this staggering dynamic and narrative complexity. It's not like the brain is just kind of finding patterns in noise. I hear that explanation a lot. It's just your brain is kind of the neural activity is being scrambled, and is very noisy in the presence of the psychedelic, which is kind of true to an extent. But then your brain is kind of finding patterns in this. And I think people who have never taken DMT might think that's a reasonable explanation. But it's not like you're just seeing flashes of, faces or, dogs or whatever. You're seeing this entirely different world that is perfectly finessed, engineered to utter perfection, perfectly precise in its, not just in its structure, but in its dynamics and the narrative structure as well. It's in my opinion, not easy to explain how your brain can achieve that. unless, just like the normal waking world, the brain is somehow using some source of sensory data. If there's some alternate, like DMT is somehow gating access to the flow of sensory information, alternate source of sensory information that it doesn't normally have access to, that might explain. And that's the kind of the working model that I go with at the moment, is that your brain is actually, you are tuning in is one way of putting it, but yes, I think your brain just doesn't spontaneously start constructing these highly complex, inordinately complex worlds, I think.
Let's go deeper into the anatomy, because I loved researching for this episode. I just found it so fascinating. But I want to understand thalamocortical loops, the effect that has on model building, both in DMT and non-DMT states, because both of those might be important for the listener to fully understand how this works. And then to go into this concept of attractor states, because again, I think these are sort of the key ideas to really understand in the brain what's happening in these states. Where do you think is the right place to start digging deeper?
Well, I mean, so if you think about what the brain is, in a simple kind of broad way, uh, it's a system of neurons, right? So you have the neurons are these fundamental information generating cells of your brain. There are millions and millions of these in your cortex, the outer layer of your brain, which is responsible for constructing your world model. And these neurons are all connected and they're talking to each other. So you have this vast, incredibly complex network of neurons that are always generating information and sharing information. And the cortex in this way is an example of what's just called a complex system, right? So a complex system is not just a complicated system. It's a system where you have lots of interacting components that often interact in relatively simple ways, but because of the vast number of the interactions, you get the emergence of high level properties. The example that I often use is a murmuration of starlings, right? So you have all of these starlings. If you've ever seen one, I've never seen one live, unfortunately, but if you've seen videos of like these starlings, that they form these beautiful kind of um, what are called murmurations, this beautiful flocks, this flocking behavior. We have all of these starlings, and they interact with very, very simple rules, and that was shown decades ago now. Just by sight. And yet from these very simple interactions, you get this beautiful dynamic behavior. And this dynamic behavior is called an emergent property. It emerges from the interactions of the vast number of components, in this case, the individual birds. And in the same way, the world that you experience emerges from the vast number of interactions between neurons. So that's, and when we come to attractor states, is that certain complex systems tend to be attracted towards certain states. Certain states are more stable, right? So we say the low energy states. So before I was talking about the world space landscape. I think about it like a landscape. If you think about all the different states that your cortex could be in, right? You can plot all of these states, a vast number of states, effectively infinite number of states. You can plot it onto a landscape, and the kind of the hills and the valleys of the landscape correspond to high energy stable states, and low energy stable states, and high energy unstable states. And the connections between the neurons will determine the structure of that landscape, which states are stable, which states are unstable. And the cortex has kind of molded itself. It's molded its connectivity, if you like, so that the low energy states are those that represent the structure of your world model, the normal waking world. So that's why I said we sit within this well within the cortical state space landscape. So these are the attractor states, if you like. So there's lots of other states your cortex could exist in that represent entirely different types of experiences, entirely different types of worlds, but your brain never reaches them because they're very, very high energy. They're hard to reach. because they're not within this attractor basin, it's often called. Now, psychedelics, what they do is they actually they stimulate certain populations of neurons, and they loosen up. They cause neurons to fire more frequently and more easily. They increase the excitability of neurons, and they allow neurons to kind of share information much more freely. And so that attractor landscape kind of flattens out. So it stops being this very deep well, and it kind of flattens out. And so what that means is the brain starts to become able to reach states now. It's no longer trapped within this deep well, this deep attractor well. It can actually start to reach and explore states beyond this attractor well, beyond this, what I call the consensus reality space. And that's really what psychedelics generally do. And this has actually been shown in neuroimaging studies now, that there is a flattening of the cortical state space landscape under the influence of psychedelics. And with most psychedelics, that's kind of not the end of the story, but that's kind of the major effect, is this flattening of the attractor landscape. But with DMT, I think something kind of different happens. I think what happens is with DMT, the perturbation of your cortex is much more robust, and you get this initial flattening of the cortical state space landscape, but then it kind of collapses into an entirely new configuration. So you get an attractor basin in an entirely different area of the world space landscape. So it's kind of like goes, maybe you can't see, I don't know what my camera's like, but initially this is your the low energy state where we exist, the consensus reality space, and the DMT world states are all up here. Yeah. And then DMT flattens out the landscape, so these states become more accessible, and then you get this kind of reverses, and you get this well within this entirely different region of the world space landscape, and your brain kind of slides into that. And this is why the DMT state, I believe, it's so robust and so stable. As long as the DMT is present, is because your entire world space landscape has been restructured temporarily, and you're in an entire different region of the world space landscape. Does that make sense? That's kind of a complicated thing. But
the Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel